Hey, welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about fantasy. It's older than pants, probably. Grab some coffee. It's going to be a long one. Maybe some gummy bears or snacks and drinks of your choice. And let me work on that screen share while you're doing that. Yeah. All right. So there we go, probably. But yeah, fantasy is older than writing, older than paper, and probably older than pants. But fantasy as a book genre or a bookshelf with expectations is pretty modern. Um, Today we're going to be speedrunning through myth, Victorian weirdos, pulp chaos, Tolkien gravity, paperback empires, D&D, grimdark, new weird, internet microgenres, and cozy pastry wizards. Fantasy didn't start with Tolkien, but fantasy as a shelf, that is way newer. All right, and there's a pretty picture for you. So, ingredients is not a genre. People ask, what was the first fantasy book? That's a trap question. Like, what was the first sandwich? Who cares? For most of history, magic stories weren't fantasy, they were religion, legend, folklore, epic romance, satire. So, fantasy, the ingredient is ancient, and fantasy, the isle, is a little bit more modern. Keep that in your pocket. I'm going to use it like pretty much a cheat code through the rest of this video. Um, some genre mechanics, like our labels, markets, and shelves. And here's a boring truth that pretty much explains everything. Genres are partially retail tech. Publishers label it, bookstores shelve it, readers learn what they're buying. A genre is when the bookstore knows where to put the thing, honestly. And once the label sticks, you get cover language, series branding, fandom wars, and critics explaining why your wizard is about capitalism. Yeah, stories create vibes, markets create labels, and labels create genres. So, yeah, bookstore aisles over here, different sections, blah, blah, blah. Yay. Next up, we're going to talk about the sibling genre minutes. Basically, fantasy's messy apartments. Fantasy didn't grow up alone. It shares a messy apartment with horror and science fiction, and they keep borrowing each other's clothes. Like for a long time, science and fantasy were kind of melded into one genre. Then you had sci fantasy, which is a weird doubling, I guess, or mixture of. Um, Gothic and weird fiction, Lynn Dread and the Uncanny. Pulps often ran fantasy, horror, and sci-fi side by side for the same readers. Bookstores split them up later. The DNA stayed kind of mixed. And if the comments pretty much argue that's horror, congrats, you found the seam that separates them. So yeah, some nifty pulp covers here. Weird tales, astounding stories, amazing stories quarterly. And off we go. So, pre-genre roots, myths give fantasy its monsters, fairy tales give it its rules, romance give it quests, satire gives it attitude. But none of this is fantasy the shelf yet. It's fantasy the human operating system, basically ingredients everywhere, genre nowhere yet. It is coming. So we got Little Dog and Scary Wolf. We got A Night in a Battlefield. We got, I don't know, people in the shadows talking very scarily to one another. Then we got our little Wizard of Oz one here. So, as modernity ramps up, belief and storytelling starts separating. The supernatural becomes an artistic tool, symbolic, emotional, philosophical, rather than simply how the world works. Um, If you want a scholarly umbrella line, Cambridge Companion Volume frames fantasy, history, and subgenre as developing, especially from the Enlightenment period onward. That's what they consider "quote unquote" fantasy, the genre. The Enlightenment didn't really kill magic; it just moved it from the fiction section. Now magic can be chosen. That's when modern fantasy becomes possible. So birth of modern fantasy novellas were pretty much the Victorian era. There we go. Yay. Um, Now fantasy starts looking a little bit more like fantasy, not folklore, not scripture, not this totally happened, a deliberate novel experience. So you got adult fairy romance energy, and then second world quest energy. This isn't fantasy learning to walk like a baby deer, wobbly, majestic, occasionally biting you. Victorians made fantasy a novel. Um, Children's fantasy expanded to Gateway River. Two major rivers feed modern fantasy. You got River One, which is adult literary slash adventure fantasy, and then you have River Two, which is children's fantasy. Pretty much the gateway stream. You want to get them when they're young, right? So they can grow up and just buy our books as adults because it's the same thing, just repackaged for adults. Ha 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 ha. Thanks, book publishers and authors. Children's fantasy normalizes wonder early. It teaches the grammar, portals, witches, talking animals, rules that aren't really physics related. And then adult fantasy catches you later, like, remember wonder? Cool. Here's 900 pages in an appendix. Adult. Children's fantasy is the gateway drug, and I do say that with love. Um, and then early 1900s, the Delta kind of branches a new form. Early 20th century fantasy becomes a Delta literary fantasy, children's fantasy, weird tales, adventure. Same kind of ingredients list, just different recipes. And the early 1900s made the fantasy branch. Um, Pulps take action, fantasy speed mode. Pulps take fantasy, give it an espresso, and hit fast forward. A lot of pulp fantasy is curse plus monster plus treasure, go. Once a vibe gets a name, it gets copied, then marketed, then franchised. Pulp's made fantasy kind of fast. Um, and like on my screen here, that's a fantasy thing. It might take you a couple days to read it, or a Saturday afternoon. They're very meant to be read fast. And then, well, we got the Tolkien event, as I like to call it. And let's go on to that. So, Tolkien didn't invent fantasy. He changed what readers expect fantasy to feel like. And I'll read that again. Tolkien did not invent fantasy. No, he didn't. He changed what readers expect fantasy to feel like. Yes, he did. So, before Tolkien, a lot of fantasy reads like a story. After Tolkien, it reads like a place. Maps, deep history, languages, a world with weight. Tolkien made fantasy a place. So, a lot of people like to think fantasy Tolkien onward. There is a lot of fantasy before Tolkien. Just to make that clear, and I may get a little bit of hate in the comments for that, I'll live with it. So, moving on to the 1960s through the 80s boom, paperback series cover language. This is the bridge people skip. Post Tolkien, fantasy becomes a machine. Paperback, shelving, cover signal, series culture. Readers know the vibe in one glance. It's very visual. You can take it all in and know exactly, hey, that's fantasy. The doorstopper doesn't happen by accident. It's a business model with dragons. Victorians made fantasy a novel. Pulps made it fast. Paperbacks made it a shelf. Let's see here. And we got a couple more images Tolkien related. There we go. Myth Tolkien today. Ha ha ha. All right. So then we have what I like to call the D&D meteor. Wait, that's a game. That's not books. Lies. There are plenty of books and role-playing games. Tabletop role-playing drops a meteor. We'll call it D&D. We'll just incorporate all of it as D&D. Fantasy becomes modular. Party roles, encounter monsters, treasure logic, dungeons as structure. The books, games, the video games swap tropes forever. D&D made fantasy very modular and systematic. And then, let's see, moving on over here. Haha, red box. So the 1990s convergence is pretty much Epic Peaks plus Gateway goes global. The 90s as a convergent decade, epic fantasy goes mainstream, and kids fantasy becomes a global gateway. Fantasy stops being a niche identity and becomes a pop default. This is when your dentist has takes, essentially. The 90s made fantasy kind of unavoidable. And then a little bit after, in between, you have fantasy versus magical realism. Pretty much a rule of thumb: fantasy foregrounds the impossible and often builds a world around it. Magical realism treats the impossible as ordinary inside a a realist texture. Fantasy builds a map. Realism acts like the map was always there. Uh, Kind of like Harry Potter. There's always wizards going around, right? They've always been there. And one is look at the magic, the other is what magic. So, fantasy is global by nature. This timeline tracks how English language publishing built the modern fantasy shelf, built the imagination pipeline, which is pretty much worldwide at this point. Today, the influence is increasingly two-way. The genre is a world conversation now. Fantasy isn't owned, it's shared amongst all of us. And moving along, this is a really cool image. I liked it. I don't know what any of it means, but I still like it. And going on over here. So in the 2000s to 2010, I like to call the grim dark plus new weird plus splintering. So when a genre gets huge, and fantasy very much has blown up in the last 20 years, I would say, dramatically. Um, when a genre gets huge, it reacts against itself. Some goes darker, grim dark. Some goes weirder, which is new weird. Most of it just branches harder. You get more granular, more niche. The labels change, the branching does not. The 2000s made fantasy splinter on purpose. It just got too big. And then the micromanagement came in. Let's see here. We'll leave the image. We'll go back one. Um, so now we're in the 2010 range. So web native shift expanded why it really thrives. Internet changes the entire ecosystem. It's pretty much frequent releases reward momentum. Community feedback loops amplify what it hits. Bin structure becomes a design feature. Algorithms deliver micro genres to the exact people who want them. The internet did not invent fantasy either, despite popular belief. It invented fantasy release schedules. The internet made fantasy a niche at scale. So, when before pre-internet, you just have clubs and maybe you met at a convention, blah blah blah. But once the internet came, you had all these opinions all in one place all of a sudden, and people thriving, wanting more of this, more of that. And then you had publishers and authors who are also mixed in with this community at that time, taking it all in, and then, yeah, making a freaking production schedule and slinging these things out more, 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 because that's more dollars, dollars, dollars. Give the people what they want, and they'll give you your money. Surprisingly, how that works. So, after that, or pretty much in today's genre, we're in modern fantasy times where the menu is pretty extensive. You've got urban fantasy, which is magic and modern city, street level, spells, hidden worlds. And then you have romantasy, which is fantasy plus romance as a main engine, and it's commercially massive. It's probably I want to say number one as far as the most selling genre, honestly. Um, then you have myth retelling, which is ancient stories with modern uh, integrity, gods, heroes, gorgeous prose. And then you have, okay, here we go. One day I'll give this thing its own video. Dark academia slash gothic fantasy. Library secrets, candlelights. What if your homework cursed you? Epic is still thriving. Faction, wars, lore. Yes, it's 900 pages, and yes, you will like it. Them's the rules. So fantasy didn't get smaller, it just pretty much got more specific. Modern fantasy isn't one genre, it's pretty much a freaking food court at this point. Um, and then moving into the 2020s, now we're kind of, I know we're not through the 2020s, but 2026, okay? Give me a break. So now we're in the vibe genres, labels based on how the book feels. Cozy fantasy is a flagship, comforting, low stakes, community healing, less save the world and more save the bakery. I'm not a fan of Save the Bakery. I want to set the bakery on fire, and now I'm going to go save the world. So, the 2020 made fantasy vibes, more or less. So, if you're not familiar, the image on my screen right now, it's pretty much where Grimdark got a lot of fans. It's from Warhammer 40K or Warhammer Fantasy. And here's a fun image of a food court, as I forgot to click forward as we were going through things. So I'm going to stop screen share for just a moment, and we're going to go through 10 books that non-fantasy readers probably, I'm not going to say are, I'm going to say probably would enjoy. So, all right. Swap back to the screen share. Where did I put it? There it is. And share. I think. Looks like it's working. All right. So, if you haven't watched this whole video and you're thinking cool history, still not sure I'd read fantasy, I got you. I definitely got you. There's at least one book here that you're going to like. So, here are 10 fantasy books that tend to work on people who don't usually read fantasy because they're either short or they're beautifully written, feel like historical or literary fiction, or they're just ridiculously readable. Um, these aren't memorized, made up word books. They are just start reading and suddenly it's 2 in the morning books. So, first up by Susanna Clark, and I'm sorry for any author or title names I'm about to butcher, but that is Parensai. It's like a mystery set in an impossible endless house, short, elegant, weird, in a prestigious HBO kind of way. If you like literary puzzle boxes, this is one that has pretty much a cheat code. Then you have Cirrus with Madeline Miller, which would be here, and which is myth retelling with modern emotional clarity. Reads like gorgeous historical fiction, except the gods are real and they're absolutely being dramatic. And then we move over to the Golem. Go away, ad. I saw you blinking on the last book. You can't fool me. The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wecker, which is immigrant New York historical novel with two mythic beings trying to pass as normal. Quiet, humane, extremely readable. And then we have the 10,000 Leagues of January by Alex E. Harrow. And that one is a portal fantasy with big adventures, energy, and a strong emotional core. If you like stories about books, doors, and what if my life had gone differently, well, this is going to hit you. Next up at number 5, we got The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. Hopefully, I didn't butcher that too bad, but I probably did. And that is basically literary fiction wearing fantasy clothing. It's got memory, love, regret, and a mist over the landscape that feels like a metaphor made physical. And then by Ursula K. Le Guin, A Wizard of Earthsea. And it's short and clean, profound. It's less special effects and more, this is about who you are when nobody's watching. And then I know what you're saying, The Hobbit, oh no, J.R. Tolkien, oh no, but it's good. I'm sorry, it is good. You have to read it. It's warm, it's funny, emotionally direct. It's basically found family, comfort fantasy with a heart the size of a golden retriever. Um, and it's classic, but it's also generally funny and brisk compared to what people think Tolkien is. And it's considered a gateway for a reason. It's very readable. And then another classic, we have Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clark. And that's pretty much going to be alternate history England where magic is returning, written like a very smart period novel. It's a brick, but it's a delicious brick, and you want more and more and more and more. Um, then one of my favorites, surprising people are shocked when I say this, is The Last Unicorn. It's poetic, it's funny, sad, timeless, and it feels like a fairy tale that grew up and learned how to be devastating. I like sad stories. This is very much sad. If you don't like sad or getting your heartstrings plucked a little bit, don't read it. The movie is also good, the animated film. And also, people don't realize Last Unicorn is a series. There's more than one book, and a lot of them have come out recently, the newer ones. The original here is very old, though. Well, not too old, but. Yeah. And then last at number 10, we have The House in the Carolean Sea. Very readable book. It's very funny. It's got some emotional elements to it. And if you like family kind of oriented, comforty fantasy things, this is that book. So if you're fantasy curious, I would advise you start with the Earthsea, perhaps Paradise, or Circe if you like myth history vibes, or the Cerulean Sea if you want comfort. And we pretty much cover what fantasy came from and what to read if you want in. And I will have links to all of these books down in the description below, per usual. I want to hear from you. What's your go-to fantasy that you either read over and over again or you recommend to friends over and over again? Let me know down in the comments what that is. If you like the video, we have a free Discord. Come join us, talk about books all day long. As long as you're doing your job, paying your bills, nothing wrong with that. If you want to support the channel and what we're doing here, we do have a Patreon. You get access to a book club or two book clubs, depending on the tier you join. We're actively reading and discussing good books. So, yeah, I think that's going to do it for today. And as always, keep on booking on.